Everyone at that table remembered the way she smiled that night. The kind of smile that settles people. The kind that makes a room feel safe, complete, untouched by worry. And if you had been sitting across from her, you would have believed it too. Because nothing about Emily Carter suggested that anything was wrong. Not the steady way she spoke. Not the way she leaned in when her husband Daniel Carter laughed. Not even the calm rhythm of her voice as she asked her son about his day. Everything about her said, this is what a good life looks like. This is what stability feels like. This is what people spend years trying to build. And yet, just hours later, standing alone in front of her bathroom mirror, that same smile disappeared as if it had never existed. Her face tightening, her breathing shifting, her hands resting on the sink just long enough for the tremor to become impossible to ignore. And in that moment, there was no audience left to convince, no expectations to meet, just a quiet realization settling in that something inside her had been changing for a long time. Something she could no longer explain away as stress or fatigue or just a bad day. Because this felt different. This felt constant, like her own mind had stopped giving her a moment of rest. And the silence of that bathroom was louder than anything she had heard all evening. Louder than the laughter, louder than the conversations, louder than the life she had been carefully maintaining. And the most unsettling part was not that it had started, but that she had become so good at hiding it that no one, not even the person closest to her, had noticed a thing. And that is where this story begins, not with a dramatic event or a sudden collapse, but with a quiet moment that almost no one saw. A moment that raises a question most people never think to ask. How long can someone carry something like this before it begins to show? And what happens when it finally does? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the truth about Emily's life is that everything you saw on the surface was real. The marriage was real. The home was real. The routines were real. But so was the weight she carried every single day. A weight that followed her into quiet rooms, into late nights, into moments that should have felt ordinary. And as the clock moved past midnight and the house fell completely still, she found herself sitting on the edge of her bed staring into the dark, her thoughts moving faster than she could control, her chest tightening in a way that made no sense. And it was in that stillness that she began to understand something she had been avoiding for months, maybe longer, that whatever this was, it was not going away on its own. And the night everything almost fell apart was no longer something in the future. It was already getting closer, and she was running out of ways to pretend she was fine. How do you live with someone every single day, share meals, conversations, quiet moments, and still not realize they are fighting something they don't know how to explain? How far can a person keep pushing through routines, responsibilities, expectations, before the pressure begins to show in ways they can no longer control? And what really happens when the truth finally comes out? Not in pieces, not softened, but all at once. Because the reality in stories like this is that the signs are rarely loud. They don't announce themselves. They don't interrupt life in obvious ways. They settle quietly into daily habits, into small pauses, into moments that are easy to overlook. And by the time anyone begins to question them, they have already been there for much longer than anyone realized. And that is exactly what makes this story difficult to understand at first. Because if you look at Emily from the outside, nothing seems out of place. She is in her late 30s, a wife, a mother, someone people would describe as dependable, someone who shows up, handles responsibilities, keeps things in order, the kind of person others rely on without hesitation. And if you ask the people around her, especially her husband Daniel, they would tell you the same thing, that she was steady, thoughtful, present, the kind of person who made life feel manageable even when things were not perfect. And yet beneath all of that, there was a growing distance between what people saw and what she experienced, a gap that widened slowly, almost quietly, until it became something she could no longer ignore. And the unsettling part is not just that it happened, but how long it went unnoticed, how easily it blended into what looked like a normal life, which leads to questions that don't have simple answers. Was she always like this in ways no one fully understood, or did something shift over time that she never spoke about? What exactly triggered the change that turned small worries into something constant? And why didn't anyone around her see it sooner? Why didn't Daniel notice the moments where her attention drifted? the times her responses came just a second too late, the nights she stayed awake longer than usual. Because when you look back, those details begin to form a pattern, one that only becomes clear after you know where the story is heading. And that is what makes this moment important, because everything you are about to understand depends on recognizing one simple truth, that what was happening inside Emily's mind was completely different from the life she was presenting to everyone else. And the closer you look, the harder it becomes to separate the two, because what was happening inside her mind was nothing like what people saw. Emily's life followed a rhythm that most people would recognize immediately, the kind of routine that feels steady, dependable, almost comforting in its predictability. She woke up early, often before the rest of the house, moving quietly through the kitchen as she prepared breakfast, measuring out portions, checking the time, making sure everything was exactly where it needed to be. There was a sense of order in the way she did things, a calm efficiency that made it look effortless. And when her son came into the room, still half awake, she greeted him with a warmth that never felt forced, asking simple questions about school, reminding him of small things he might forget. And when Daniel joined them, there was an ease in their conversation, light exchanges, familiar jokes, nothing that would suggest anything beneath the surface was shifting, because from the outside, Emily was exactly who people believed her to be: calm, reliable, always in control, the kind of person others admired without needing to think too much about why. And if you looked at the images she shared, the photos from family outings, the moments captured during birthdays, holidays, small celebrations, everything aligned perfectly with that impression. Smiles that seemed genuine, moments that looked complete, a life that felt stable. And yet, even within those moments, there were details that didn't quite fit, pauses that lasted just a little longer than expected, decisions that took more time than they should, expressions that held for a second too long before fading. Things that were easy to dismiss if you weren't paying close attention, but over time, they began to form a pattern, one that suggested something was beginning to shift, something subtle enough to go unnoticed, but consistent enough to matter. And the truth is, these changes didn't arrive all at once. They appeared gradually, in ways that felt small, almost insignificant at first, which is why Emily didn't see them as a problem, not in the beginning, because at first, it was just a thought she couldn't let go of, a conversation she replayed in her mind longer than necessary, a simple decision that suddenly felt more complicated than it should have been, and it was easy to explain it away, to tell herself she was just tired, just distracted, just dealing with more than usual. But as the days passed, those moments started to happen more often. Conversations didn't end when they were supposed to, they continued. In her mind long after they were over, every word analyzed, every tone questioned, every reaction reconsidered. And at night, when everything around her became quiet, her mind refused to follow. Instead it moved faster, jumping from one thought to another, revisiting things that had already happened, anticipating things that hadn't, creating a kind of restlessness that made it difficult to relax, difficult to sleep. And then there were moments that felt even harder to explain, brief but intense. Waves of fear that appeared without warning, not tied to anything specific, not connected to any clear cause, just a sudden shift in her body that left her unsettled, searching for a reason that never fully made sense. And still, she kept it to herself, because none of it seemed serious enough to talk about. None of it felt like something that required attention. It was small, manageable, easy to hide. And that's exactly what she did. She hid it in the way she responded to messages, rereading them multiple times before replying, deleting words, rewriting them, trying to make sure everything sounded right, trying to avoid the possibility of being misunderstood. And from the outside, nothing about that behavior stood out. It blended into the normal flow of daily life. But internally, it was becoming harder to keep up, harder to maintain the sense of control she had always relied on. Because while everything around her continued to look the same, something inside her was beginning to change in a way she couldn't fully understand. And the most difficult part was that it didn't stop, it didn't slow down. It continued building quietly, steadily, until the space between her outward life and her internal experience became impossible to ignore. And even then, she tried to manage it the only way she knew how, by pushing through, by maintaining appearances, by convincing herself that it would pass. But inside, her mind never stopped, and as time went on, the weight of it became harder to carry. The thoughts became more persistent, the feelings more intense, and the sense of control she once had started to feel less certain, less stable. And that is when everything began to shift in a way she could no longer contain. Because what started as something small, something easy to ignore, was no longer staying quiet. And then, it got louder. As the days moved forward, the changes Emily had been trying to manage quietly began to demand more attention than she could give. Her thoughts no longer came in brief moments that passed on their own. They stayed longer, repeated themselves, overlapped in ways that made it difficult to focus on anything else. And even during the simplest parts of her routine, there was a growing sense that something wasn't settling the way it used to. Her breathing would shift unexpectedly, not enough to alarm anyone around her, but enough for her to notice, enough to make her pause for a second before continuing. And those pauses became more frequent, more noticeable to her even if no one else seemed to react. And then there were moments when small things started to feel heavier than they should have. A misplaced item, a delayed response, a minor change in plans. Things that once felt manageable now carried a weight she couldn't easily shake off. And she tried to keep up, to respond the way she always had, to maintain the same tone, the same pace, the same presence. But inside, it was becoming harder to hold everything in place, because what looked normal from the outside was beginning to feel overwhelming in ways she couldn't explain. And one afternoon, in a place as ordinary as a grocery store, that feeling became impossible to ignore. The noise around her, the movement of people, the small, constant sounds that usually faded into the background suddenly felt amplified, sharper, harder to process all at once. And as she moved through the aisles, something shifted, her steps slowed, her focus narrowed, and for a brief moment, she stopped completely, standing still while everything around her continued, her mind trying to catch up with what her body was already reacting to, her breathing tightening just enough to make her aware of it, just enough to make her question what was happening. And even though the moment passed, even though she managed to continue and finish what she came to do, it stayed with her, not as a single event, but as a sign that something was changing in a way she could no longer dismiss. Because what looked normal to everyone else was starting to feel unbearable to her. And that realization didn't bring clarity. It brought uncertainty, a growing awareness that she was losing control over something she didn't fully understand. And that awareness followed her home, stayed with her through the evening, through dinner, through the quiet moments that came after, until the house finally settled into silence. Daniel asleep beside her, the lights off, everything as it should be. And yet she found herself unable to rest, sitting upright, her breathing uneven, her thoughts moving faster than she could keep track of. And as the minutes passed, that feeling returned, stronger this time, more intense, not tied to any clear reason, just a sudden wave that made it difficult to stay still, difficult to feel grounded in the space around her. And for the first time, the thought crossed her mind that something might actually be wrong, not in a vague, passing way, but in a way that demanded attention. And that realization brought with it a level of fear she hadn't felt before, because it wasn't just the feeling itself, it was the uncertainty of it, the lack of explanation, the sense that she was experiencing something she couldn't control. And in that moment, sitting in the quiet of her own home, she considered waking Daniel, telling him what was happening, letting someone else see what she had been trying so hard to manage on her own. And she even turned slightly, as if she might reach out, as if she might finally break the silence she had maintained for so long. But then she stopped, the hesitation settling in just as quickly as the thought had come, because saying it out loud would make it real in a way she wasn't ready to face. It would change the way he saw her, the way she saw herself. And so instead, she chose the only option that felt familiar. She stayed quiet. She waited for the feeling to pass. She convinced herself she could handle it, just like she had every other time. And eventually, the intensity eased enough for her to lie back down, enough for her to close her eyes, even if sleep didn't come right away. And by morning, everything appeared normal again. The routine resumed, the same calm presence, the same steady voice, nothing outwardly different. And yet something had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. Because that night was not just another moment she could dismiss, it was a turning point, a clear indication that what she was experiencing was no longer small, no longer something she could easily manage. And still, she chose to keep it to herself, to move forward as if nothing had changed, and that decision, the choice to remain silent when she came closest to speaking, kept the secret alive. After that night, nothing in Emily's world appeared different, and that was exactly what made it so difficult to understand, because on the surface, everything continued the way it always had. Mornings still began with the same routine, conversations still flowed the same way, and anyone looking in from the outside would have no reason to question whether anything had changed. But internally, the experience stayed with her, not as a single memory, but as something that returned again and again, especially in the quiet hours when there was nothing to distract her from it. And so she adapted, not by addressing what she was feeling, but by learning how to move around it, how to carry it without letting it interrupt the life she had built. And over time, she became remarkably good at it. So much so that the difference between what she showed and what she experienced became almost impossible to detect. During the day she smiled, she engaged, she responded exactly the way people expected her to. She laughed at the right moments, maintained conversations, handled responsibilities with the same level of care she always had. And in those moments, even she could almost believe that everything was under control. But when the day slowed down, when the distractions faded and the house became quiet again, that sense of control began to slip. The thoughts returned, the tension built, and the same feelings she had tried to ignore resurfaced with a persistence that made it harder each time to push them aside. And it was in those private moments that the contrast became clear, because the person who appeared calm and steady in public was the same person sitting alone later, trying to steady her breathing, trying to quiet a mind that refused to slow down. And the effort it took to maintain that balance began to wear on her in ways she hadn't anticipated, because pretending wasn't just about hiding something from others. It required constant energy, constant awareness, constant adjustment, and the longer she kept it up, the more difficult it became to sustain. And yet she continued, because stopping meant explaining, and explaining meant facing something she still didn't fully understand. And so she told herself the same thing she had been telling herself from the beginning, that it would pass, that it wasn't serious, that she just needed time. But even as she held on to that belief, there were signs that others were beginning to notice small changes, subtle differences that didn't align with the person they knew. Daniel, in particular, started to pick up on things he couldn't quite place. Moments where her attention seemed distant, times when her responses were shorter than usual, nights when she seemed more restless, more tired than she would admit. And at first, his questions were simple, almost casual, the kind of questions that come from concern but don't expect anything serious in return, asking if she was getting enough rest, if something at home or outside had been bothering her, if everything was okay. And each time, her answer came quickly, almost automatically, a quiet reassurance that there was nothing to worry about, that she was fine, and the word itself became a kind of shield, a way to close the conversation before it went any further, because saying anything more would require her to put into words something she still couldn't fully explain. And so the pattern continued. He asked, she reassured, and life moved on. But beneath those brief exchanges, there was a growing tension, a sense that something wasn't being said, something that both of them could feel in different ways. Because while Emily was focused on keeping everything in place, Daniel was beginning to sense that something didn't quite add up. And even though he didn't have a clear reason, the repetition of those small moments started to form a question he couldn't ignore. And still, she maintained the same response, the same calm tone, the same simple answer, "I'm fine." And in doing so, she believed she was protecting the life they had, keeping things stable, preventing unnecessary worry. But what she didn't realize was that those words, repeated over time, were creating distance rather than preventing it. Because the most difficult truths are often the ones left unspoken, and the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell the people closest to us, not out of harm, but out of fear, out of uncertainty, out of the hope that we can manage things on our own. And for a while, it seemed like she could continue this way, balancing both the sides of her experience without letting them collide. But eventually, that balance began to shift, because there are limits to how long something like this can remain hidden, and those limits don't always announce themselves clearly. Sometimes they appear in a single moment, one that changes everything. And for Emily, that moment came without warning, during a time that should have felt ordinary. Another episode building the way it had before, but stronger this time, more intense, harder to control. And as she tried to move through it, to maintain the same composure she had practiced so many times, something didn't hold. Her breathing changed, her focus slipped, and for the first time, she couldn't keep it contained within herself. Daniel was there, close enough to notice the shift, close enough to see what she had been hiding. And in that moment, the space between what she presented and what she experienced disappeared completely, replaced by a silence that carried more weight than any conversation they had avoided, because for the first time, someone else saw it, not as a possibility, not as a suspicion, but as something real, something undeniable, and there was no immediate explanation, no carefully prepared response, just a pause that stretched longer than either of them expected, and then, slowly, the words began to come, not perfectly, not all at once, but enough to break the pattern she had held onto for so long, enough to let him see what had been happening. Beneath the surface, the thoughts, the feelings, the moments she couldn't control, the nights she had spent trying to manage it on her own. And as she spoke, there was an uncertainty in her voice, not just about how he would respond, but about whether she was even explaining it the right way, because this was the first time she had allowed it to exist outside of her own mind. And yet, instead of confusion or distance, what she found was something she hadn't fully expected, a quiet understanding, a willingness to listen without interruption, without judgment, and that response, simple as it was, shifted something in her, because it meant she didn't have to carry it alone anymore. And from that point forward, the conversation didn't end. It continued in ways that gradually made space for something different, something more honest. And with that came the decision to take a step she had avoided until now, to seek help beyond what she and Daniel could figure out on their own. And with his support, she began to explore what she had been experiencing in a way that gave it structure, context, a clearer understanding of what was happening and why. And while it didn't change everything immediately, it marked the beginning of something she hadn't allowed herself before, a process of addressing it instead of avoiding it, of understanding it instead of fearing it. And with professional help and support from her husband, she finally started to understand what she was going through. What followed for Emily was not a sudden shift or a complete return to the version of herself she remembered. It was something slower, more deliberate, a process that required patience in ways she hadn't been used to, because for so long she had measured her ability to cope by how well she could maintain control, how effectively she could keep everything in place without anyone noticing. And now she was being asked to do something entirely different, to step back, to observe, to understand, rather than suppress. And that change alone felt unfamiliar at first. Sitting in a quiet room, speaking about experiences she had spent months trying to minimize, putting words to feelings that never seemed clear enough to explain. But gradually, through those conversations, patterns began to emerge, connections she hadn't seen before, ways of understanding her thoughts that made them feel less overwhelming, less unpredictable. And while the sensations didn't disappear immediately, they started to make more sense, which changed the way she responded to them. Instead of reacting with fear, she began to recognize what was happening in the moment, to pause rather than resist, to use the techniques she was learning to steady herself when the familiar tension returned. And outside of those sessions, Daniel remained present in a way that made the process easier to continue, not by trying to fix everything, but by listening, by giving her the space to be honest without feeling like she needed to return to the version of herself she had been presenting before. And that support created an environment where she no longer felt the need to hide every difficult moment, where she could speak about her day without filtering out the parts that didn't fit the image she once felt responsible for maintaining. And over time, those small changes began to add up. The nights became more manageable, the moments of restlessness less intense, the thoughts easier to navigate. And even though there were still days when the old patterns resurfaced, they no longer carried the same weight, because she now had a way to respond to them, a way to move through them without feeling completely overtaken. And that shift, subtle as it was, began to reflect in other areas of her life. Her conversations became more open, her reactions less guarded, her presence more grounded in what she was actually feeling rather than what she believed she needed to show. And the difference could be seen in moments that once felt routine, a smile that no longer needed to be held in place, a pause that didn't carry the same pressure, a sense of calm that wasn't forced but gradually returned on its own. And while the process was not perfect, while it required continued effort and awareness, it marked a clear change from where she had been, because it didn't disappear overnight, but it became manageable, and in that space, between what she once hid and what she was now learning to face, she found something that had been missing for a long time, a sense of relief that came not from everything being resolved, but from no longer having to carry it alone. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't have to pretend. In the end, nothing about Emily's life needed to look dramatically different for everything to feel different. The same dinner table, the same chairs, the same familiar routine that once felt like something she had to carefully maintain now existed without the same pressure behind it. And if you were sitting there watching her, you might not immediately understand what had changed, because the setting was the same, the people around her were the same, even the conversations carried the same tone. But the difference was in something far less obvious, something that could only be understood if you knew what came before it. Because this time, when she smiled, it wasn't something she had to hold in place or think about maintaining. It came naturally, without the quiet tension that used to follow it, without the need to retreat later and recover from it. And that subtle shift, the absence of that internal strain, was what made the moment meaningful in a way that couldn't be easily explained to someone who hadn't experienced it. Because for months, she had lived between two versions of herself, the one the world saw and the one she struggled to manage in silence. And now, those two versions no longer felt as distant from each other as they once did, not because everything had been solved, but because she had allowed them to meet, to exist in the same space without one needing to hide the other. And that is where the real change happened, not in a single moment of realization, not in one conversation or one decision, but in the gradual understanding that she didn't have to carry everything alone, that asking for help didn't take anything away from who she was. It gave her the ability to be present in a way she hadn't been for a long time. And as the evening continued, as the small sounds of conversation filled the room again, there was a quiet sense of ease that hadn't been there before, something that didn't need to be explained or pointed out, because it could be felt in the way she listened, the way she responded, the way she allowed herself to exist in that moment without anticipating what might come next. And that is what makes this story stay with you. Not the struggle on its own, but the realization that it can exist even in lives that appear steady, even in people who seem composed, because sometimes, the people who look the strongest are the ones carrying the most, the ones who have learned how to keep going even when things feel uncertain, and the ones who, at some point, have to decide whether to continue holding everything inside or to let someone else in. And when that decision is made, when that shift begins, it doesn't always change everything at once, but it changes enough to make moments like this possible again. Moments where nothing needs to be hidden, nothing needs to be forced. And for Emily, sitting at that same table where everything once looked perfect but felt completely different, that is where the story finds its resolution, not in perfection, but in honesty, because sometimes, the people who look the strongest are the ones fighting the hardest battles, and sometimes, the most important change is the one no one else can see, until it finally shows in something as simple as a real smile. And when you think about Emily's story, it becomes harder to look at the people around you the same way, because her life didn't fall apart in a way that forced attention. It didn't announce itself with something obvious or easy to recognize. It stayed hidden in plain sight, woven into routines, conversations, everyday moments that looked completely normal. And that is what makes it resonate long after the story ends, because it raises a question that doesn't belong only to her. It extends outward, into families, into friendships, into the quiet spaces where people assume everything is fine simply because nothing appears out of place. And it makes you wonder how many others are moving through their days in the same way, carrying something they haven't found the words to explain, maintaining the same balance between what they feel and what they show, and whether the signs are there in ways we don't always recognize. Which is why stories like this matter, not because they are rare, but because they are often overlooked. So let me ask you this. Have you ever known someone who seemed completely fine but wasn't? Someone who showed up every day, smiled, engaged, and gave no clear indication that anything was wrong. And if you think about it long enough, you might realize that the answer isn't as simple as it first appears, and maybe the more difficult question is one that turns inward. Have you ever felt like you had to hide what you were going through, like explaining it would change how people see you, or make something feel more real than you were ready to face? Because if there's one thing Emily's experience makes clear, it's that silence can feel easier in the moment, but it often carries a weight that grows over time. And sometimes, the most important step is the one that breaks that silence. Even if it's small, even if it's uncertain, and if stories like this matter to you, if they make you pause, reflect, or see things differently, and if stories like this matter to you, the kind that stay with you long after they end, then subscribe, because the next story might make you question even more than this one did. And this time, you might see the signs differently.